Well, welcome to API Days, to this stream, which is the building the tech stack, building the finance tech stack stream. I hope you're all ready for some fantastic presentations. We've got some excellent speakers lined up for you today. My name is Graham. I'll be the MC, just keeping things moving along as we go through the presentations. Now, first of all, we have a presentation called Designing Embedded Platforms, Lessons from Industry Success and Failure. And this will be given to us by Jeremy Glassenberg, who is the product lead for APIs at Docusign. Now, Jeremy has 14 years of experience building APIs and growing developer ecosystems at successful startups such as Box and TradeShift. He has several API product organizations and developer relations programs at companies in various industries, from supply chain to fintech and drones. And he is currently working on APIs for Docusign. So please welcome Jeremy Glassenberg.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you everyone for joining in today. I should first and foremost note that I am not the product lead at Docusign. I'm just a product lead at Docusign. Docusign today has quite a significant investment in APIs today and a very nice team of experienced folk. But anywho, today we are talking about what I call embedded integration platforms or embedded integration frameworks, which, disclaimer, is not an actual official industry term. So to clarify exactly what this is about, it's really when you are creating a platform that enables partners, enables developers to bring in their own interface into your application. So it's going beyond APIs and actually allowing third parties to be embedded in your own UI. We're going to talk about a little bit of the history of these frameworks, the many successes and many failures from which we can learn in industry to understand what it takes to really build a successful embedded integration framework. This is a platform that has had actually a very struggling history before being successful. And so it'll be very helpful, I think, to dive into both the successes and the failures, which we'll get into today. A quick about me, although you already got a pretty good overview. Basically, I've been working on various APIs at many companies, most notably Box and TradeShift, but I've worked on APIs in a range of industries: education technology, supply chain. Yes, currently I'm working for Docusign. In the process, while building many platforms, I've also worked on many partner APIs over the years. And there's one particular topic that's always been exciting me, these embedded integration frameworks. But first, you really should go into a little bit of the history of where these things started and why you may have heard about them recently, may have heard about them in the past, but for a while have seen not much of it. In order to understand that, let's dive right into the history of APIs and the embedded frameworks alongside. Basically, when I got into API world starting full-time in 2008 at Box, this was before we were known as the API craze. That started in 2009, and that craze has really only gotten crazier over the many years. We have just seen over and over again the number of companies having APIs constantly growing year over year as every company needs to build APIs. Now, throughout these years, going all the way back to before 2009, and yeah, I was there before the 2009 craze, so I guess I was in APIs before they were cool. Definitely not a hipster, though. Definitely not a hipster. But I got to see in this period of growth all the success that APIs brought, but also many struggles, many, a lot of trial and error, many experiments that just didn't really pan out. And throughout that, what we saw was basically a standardization in the world of APIs towards REST, towards JSON, towards the open API standards, so we have more consistency in our APIs. But there were other experiments that didn't really pan out, and for a while actually had a lull. And I'd like to take a quick survey. Feel free just to post in the comments today if you know about any of these past platforms, starting with iGoogle. Anyone remember this? Usually in the group, I see like 3 or 4 folk who remember iGoogle. Okay. Say a couple of yups. Feel free just to write no, by the way, if you haven't seen it. But basically, this goes back to around 2005, I think, where Google created an alternative homepage that was highly customizable. You could have a weather app. You could have your own calendar. You could have a little embeddable version of Gmail. You could have news. You could even have a calculator. And they eventually allowed anyone to build an app for iGoogle. Anyone remember this one, though? Yeah, it kind of faded out over time. Let me see if anyone remembers this one from LinkedIn. There was a time when LinkedIn actually allowed for third parties to be part of your LinkedIn account, where you could say have a presentation that you could share on your LinkedIn profile by just embedding the presentation on your LinkedIn profile. Or there was something from WordPress to actually bring WordPress content into your LinkedIn profile. Anyone remember this one? So when I was at Box, we actually got to be a launch partner for the LinkedIn platform. We also got to watch as it flopped and shut down. Now, interestingly, these are just a couple of many examples of this sort of embedded framework bringing third parties into an interface 10 plus years ago that didn't pan out. They were unsuccessful products at companies that otherwise were largely successful. What happened here? Well, there was actually back at this time a lot of, quite a few efforts, a lot of this of companies trying to basically make the web work like an operating system. In fact, there was literally a company that was trying to make the web look like an operating system. It was called UOS. It was a Y Combinator startup. And the whole thing was actually just a web page where you could install these JavaScript and HTML apps in an interface that just looked like a Windows desktop. This thing didn't really pan out too well either. What basically happened here is that this idea, the web as an OS, was pretty cool, but what was the point? And so we had to really look at these platforms. When APIs were getting popular, the idea of making the web as an OS got popular as well, but it didn't really fly. And it was because, in my opinion, we just weren't really applying product management process. And this is where I emphasize this quote that I commonly hear in tech: if you build it, they will come. It does not work. It doesn't work anywhere in product management. It doesn't work in APIs, and it didn't work for these embedded frameworks. Incidentally, the quote where this quote actually comes from a movie, Field of Dreams. And in that movie, what they build is a baseball field, and the people who come are the ghosts of the Chicago White Sox players who took a bribe to throw a World Series. In other words, in the movie where this quote actually comes from, they didn't really attract the customers you want. So this is where I emphasize the need for product process. Sometimes we get really excited about an idea and then we build it and just assume it's going to land for customers. But it doesn't work that way. Product process is all about knowing your customers, knowing your users, understanding the problems they have, coming up with solutions to those problems, really understanding what are people trying to do with your product and focusing on problem solving. When you focus on the user, that's when you see success. So for a long time, we had seen products like iGoogle and LinkedIn's framework fall apart. An unfortunate challenge with that as well is that, if an API doesn't work out and you have to shut it down, okay, many developers may be bothered by it, but maybe your customers didn't notice it because you didn't build that big an ecosystem. But when these embedded frameworks are actually bringing third-party apps into your interface and you shut it down, your users notice it. So many companies felt the embarrassment of that, and I think they had to be very, very careful, and they just kind of shunned away from it. Whereas we had some trial and error with other aspects of APIs that trended to success. But now, after a lull of a few years, I started to see over the last 3 or 4 years, really, a comeback of companies opening up their interfaces for third parties and applying use cases, thinking what actually makes sense for our users. Per Gmail, there are many little experiments with how to actually bring third-party apps into Gmail. And now they have a nice interface where it fits in the sidebar, interacts with the compose window. We'll get into that a little bit more. And if we look at, say, Trello, a project management tool, they figured out the use cases of saying, hey, why don't we have Planning Poker enable that in cards and in tickets themselves. They figured out where customers want to customize the experience and bring third-party apps there by applying product process. And we are really seeing the success over the past many years. Google Workspace, Trello, Slack's APIs, Shopify, Wix has been experimenting quite a bit. Even Twitch in the gaming world has seen a lot of success in opening up their interface to third parties. And I got the privilege of working with and speaking with product managers and developer advocates at all of these platforms. And I got to learn from them many of their secrets, their tips and tricks to success, and also their history and many of their mistakes as they made their way to having a successful platform. We're going to talk about next some of these strategic items. Then we'll get into some design aspects of what you need to enable developers to build these sort of platforms. And then we'll get into some final technical items and security items. But first and foremost, the business needs to make sure that your embedded framework can actually be successful. It comes back to product management. We have to focus on the user and their problems. Real problems, and then come up with solutions and validate that these are problems that can be solved by third parties. In other words, don't just plop iframes around and other embeddable components around in your site where they look cool. If you think that's going to make your site look cool, it's not going to be cool. It's going to look like something that was cool in the 80s. And you know what? The 80s weren't cool. What I learned when talking with all these companies that had successful platforms is that they had already gathered plenty of customer feedback before launching. In fact, the majority of these platforms didn't just have customer feedback. They literally watched as customers tried to hack around the limitations of their platforms, maybe by building Chrome extensions that injected JavaScript into their site, trying to literally force third-party integrations into their app when they didn't have a platform. And then the platforms would learn from what kind of hacks are happening and build accordingly. With that, I have to also emphasize that you're not going to get feedback unless you have users. I've seen many platforms launch excitedly because they see this happening in the industry, but they don't have any customer feedback. In fact, they don't even have a user base. Newsflash, to have an embedded framework, you are going to be the distribution channel for your customers. These partners are going to be building apps for you that they expect your consumers and your customers to use. Embedded frameworks go hand in hand with an app marketplace model. I'm not going to get into that today, but basically, there's no point in enabling third-party solutions for consumers if it's this kind of a platform, unless you have users and have potential demand ready to go. So first and foremost, it's about building a core product, having customers, and then establishing, yes, there's an unmet need that can only be met by third parties in your interface. It all comes down to having users first and getting feedback from them. Then we can get into what this framework will actually entail. And with that, when we're ready to build a platform and open up our interface for third parties, how do we do that? There are several possible ways of doing it, and we've seen many pros and cons. The most common being the iframe. We'll dive more into all three of these, but the iframe is basically that free and flexible, just let people put whatever they want in a little part of your web page. Or we can get into cards, which is basically where you're predefining what the interface can look like and what developers can actually do in your interface. Finally, I call this triggers, but it's really more miscellaneous. It's just to emphasize how you can think outside the box and try different things that just work well for your platform. Let's take a look at all three of these. Okay, first, just the iframes. Again, this is the oldest, but also the most common. It's basically just saying that anyone can put any HTML, JavaScript, CSS that they want pre-written and have it just load on your site. It's simple for you. It's very simple for the partner. They have plenty of freedom to build whatever they want to integrate. But yeah, security is going to be an issue here. Many companies will simply not do this because the security team is going to say, heck no. Even if the partners can be trusted, you never know when a partner is going to get hacked. and then they can't be trusted. But there's also an issue of performance. This was a lesser known issue. Several of these platforms that were unsuccessful had confided in me that if they wanted to allow for more than 2 or 3 third-party apps loaded in a single session, everything just kind of broke down because you would never know if the partner was having a performance issue on their site, and if the iframe would just take too long to load, or if something else was going wrong. So there are a lot of risks with iframes, but they're still very popular because for many of your partners, it's the easiest way for them to integrate. The trend now, though, is to what we're calling cards, which is basically where you say, we're not going to let you post whatever you want on our site. We're especially not going to let you put JavaScript that we can't control in our page. Instead, we have some predefined UI components that you get to use to define how your integration is going to look in our interface. And then you can have some server-side code to interact. It's all going to be just behind the scenes via API calls and webhooks. Now, this definitely keeps your security team happy. And I have to emphasize that it's not always about security. Sometimes companies have chosen cards because they have a vital mobile experience. You more commonly see cards when the product has a dependency in the mobile experience. Like for Gmail, iframes aren't really a good experience when in a mobile app. But by enabling cards, Gmail enables third parties to integrate not only in the Gmail site on your desktop, but in the Gmail mobile app. Slack as well. They understood that Slack is used so heavily on mobile that they needed to go the card route. A challenge for cards, unfortunately, is just it's fundamentally limited. For many of these platforms, companies I advise, they struggle to actually work with the card framework and sometimes reluctantly go back to Chrome extensions, injecting scripts, and basically hacking solutions. And I'm happy to say that over the years, there's been plenty of iteration on cards, and it's getting better and better, more accommodating to various use cases. But I still concede, unfortunately, it is limited. Now, there are, at least until we improve the cards experience, options. Intercom, in my opinion, has gotten the best near-term solution, which is basically combining both cards and iframes. They basically let you, they encourage cards to be used because if you're using cards, it's a simpler, smoother experience. It works better in mobile. But if you absolutely need to use an iframe, they do allow it. And what they do is push the partner to first create a card integration, but enable when necessary an iframe integration. I think this will be a trend for now, but we will see some other things coming along. Maybe more of AMP, maybe more of cards as we learn more and as we iterate. But with that, I want to emphasize that there's still more to bringing interfaces exclusively into your interface these way. Let's think outside the box. I've seen this when I was at Box. I've seen it in Google Drive. I've seen this in Google Docs, where they allow you to say in Google Drive, right-click on a file, and send that file to a third-party app to interact, like an image editor. They do this without iframes. All they do is load a new window. Or sometimes when you right-click, things just happen server-side, like you want to fax a file with eFax. It would just happen behind the scenes. This comes down to understanding your user's needs and then thinking creatively as to how third-party apps really should become part of your smooth experience and may not require iframes and may not require an advanced UI framework at all. So in the time that I have now, I still have to also emphasize, besides the technology, and besides thinking about the user experience and saying there's security and performance, but also user experience. Can we go with cards? Can we go with iframes? What can we do to make it as easy as possible for our partners, for developers to build apps on such a platform? For developers, we have to start, of course, with APIs. They just go hand in hand with the embed framework. I will emphasize that you may want to make APIs specific to this integration. If you're going to allow something to fit in a box and an iframe on your page, you're fundamentally limiting them from interacting with anything outside the page. What if you have APIs that allow that app to dynamically update your page, to say in Gmail, interact with the compose window, in Trello, interact with the card that the user's on? You don't want them to have access through via JavaScript to the DOM outside of the iframe, but you can provide APIs that allow them to safely interact outside of the iframe. This is really step one. The most basic requirement for a good embed framework is allowing APIs that meet the use case for these third-party integrations. Next, well, logically, many of these integrations, especially if it's iframed in, they're going to be HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So we might as well enable a JavaScript library so that developers can just easily write code in JavaScript that interacts with your APIs. And in fact, once you go there, if everything is hosted client-side, theoretically, you can host, as the platform, you can actually host the code entirely yourself and let third parties write apps that they don't have to host if it's all client-side code. There are many caveats to this, and there are even other platforms that are allowed third parties to host to run server-side code. I don't have too much time to discuss that today, but I am available if anyone wants to reach out to me to share my research on that as well if you are looking into code hosting. And finally, I always emphasize the need to support them through the UI. When you're bringing third-party apps in your interface, you want to enable your partners to have the freedom to build what they want, but it's better if they're able to have a style that aligns with the style that you have for your site. And rather than force that, do what you can to make it easier for developers. Motivate them to want to build an app that's more consistent with your interface. So once you have that, say, client-side SDK or library, you can provide in there UI components they can call programmatically. This is in the case of iframes, but having pre-built interfaces that they can use and program that have the nice look and feel that fits naturally with your interface. It makes it easier for your partners to code an integration, and it ensures that these integrations are more aligned with your UI. I also have to emphasize the need for security, and we only had so much time today, so I will just leave one point of the many to consider for security. But there's one unique aspect. Well, there are many unique aspects to this sort of a platform. I just have to note, really think through API scopes and permissions. For example, in, say, Google Drive, if I'm going to right-click on an image and I want to edit that image through a third-party app, the third-party app needs read permissions, it needs write permissions, but it only needs access to that one image I want to edit. It shouldn't need access to everything in Google Drive. And Google Drive understood this. Box also understood this to enable special scopes just for this sort of a platform. In Google Drive's case, enabling such apps to only have access to the file that you've selected to open and edit. Nothing else in Google Drive. It can overwrite this file, but it can't, say, create a new folder. It can't view other files in your Google Drive account. Really, really watch scope. And with that, I encourage you all to just keep a lookout for future opportunities. Keep thinking of your customer. Keep testing out new technologies. This space, as it really had a lull, and it's only starting to come back and do well today. And all the companies that I've spoken with who have successful frameworks have emphasized this. They're still experimenting. They're still learning what works well for their developers and their customers. Maybe AMP is going to overtake Cards. Maybe Cards is going to overtake iframes. Keep a lookout and keep dreaming. And if we do so, we'll continue to have these solid experiences in a smoother WebOS that actually works for customers. All right, I went a little bit over time, but I think we have time for a couple of minutes of Q&A. If anyone has any questions for me. Trying to see here, were there any questions in the comments?
Thanks for that, Jeremy. I do have a question. Do you think it's easier for people with iframes because they're kind of a known quantity? Everybody knows them. They're there as part of the HTML. Are there other frameworks around for things like the cards and the triggers that are easily accessible?
Yeah, so this admittedly is my shorter version of this presentation for API Days. We have a lot more content on this topic. So it's hard to explain this one in 20 minutes. But what I do emphasize there is there are alternatives to iframes, there are alternatives to cards, and there's continued experimentation. Now for iframes, there are many reasons why it's more popular. For one, it's easier for the platform to set up. It's also easier for developers who just, it's HTML, JavaScript. There's nothing more you need to learn. Often when you're building one integration that's iframe, you can kind of reuse that embeddable component you have for another platform. But there are security issues. There are performance issues. iframes are still popular because cards are fundamentally very limited. That said, we've seen improvements. For iframes, you can have certain restrictions. You can't prevent iframes from having pop-ups. There have been some improvements through just HTML5 going back a few years that allow these frameworks to be a little bit more secure. I've been kind of positive towards AMP as well, as a way of saying you can do HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but fundamentally restrict it, further restrict it. And I think that may allow for still iframing, just restricted iframing. I think we're at time, so I guess if anyone else has any questions, you can track me down online and on LinkedIn.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Jeremy. That was excellent talk. It's right in my wheelhouse there, so I really appreciate you spending time with us.